All right, folks, welcome to the Ruben ODSU Department of Government's post-midterm election roundtable. I am Dr. Brian Kreischen here in the department. I will be serving as moderator for tonight. Tonight we are blessed with many of our faculty members here to give their input onto the election that just occurred. We have Dr. Kuzan, Distinguished University Professor, Dr. David Ramsey, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department, Dr. Adam Caton, Associate Professor, and as a special guest, Dr. Jacob Shively is here as well, Associate Professor. So we have a full house in terms of the faculty here in the department to give a breakdown of what had just happened. In terms of how this is going to work tonight, we're going to start out with our faculty members offering a little bit of insight into what just took place and I guess is still ongoing. Some of the counting is still ongoing. Give their thoughts and sort of insights in what they think is happening. We'll start with Dr. Kuzan, then we'll go with Dr. Ramsey, Dr. Shively, and then we'll finish with Dr. Caton. After that, we'll open the floor up to questions from the audience. Please type the questions that you have into the question box so we can see them and pick them out. And that way, hopefully, we can answer your questions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and turn it over to our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Kuzan offering a little bit of insight here. And in particular, Dr. Kuzan, we're interested to know how the election results how your predictions played up with the election results. So please, Dr. Kuzan.
Well, first of all, I never made a prediction. But what I did do was I sort of looked at the historical record, and I wanted to see what would be a baseline. So given the historical record, under the circumstances that we have a Democratic president in the midterm, what would be expected given history? In other words, what was the average? And what I looked at it as the percentage of the membership in the Democratic caucus, so to speak. And basically, that sort of computed into a loss of about 27 seats, I believe. That was kind of the expected loss. Now, 8 other political scientists, they actually did have forecasting models, and they assembled the models, and the models were published, believe it or not, in Le Figaro, a French newspaper, because one of the members of the political forecasting group in the Association of the Political Science Association, he's a Frenchman. So he took in all these models and he kind of looked at the forecast, and he posted that at Le Figaro. And when I average all those models, that range from an expected forecast of 19 seats lost for the Democrats all the way up to the upper 30s for the Democrats. So high teens, high 30s. Well, we tend to kind of average. We don't go by any one model. We try to average them out. And so when you average them, the forecast was 28 seats, just one more than the expected seat that I have. Now, there was a lot of hype going into the election about a red wave, a red tsunami, and I was kind of skeptical of that because I didn't see the conditions for that. But nevertheless, I said, well, what would be expected? What would it look like if there were a red wave? What would it look like? And basically, by taking a statistic that I don't need to get into, what I said it at, if the Democrats lose more than 40 seats, that would be a red wave. If they lose more than 50, that would be a tsunami. But the fact is that the Democrats didn't have a very large membership in the House. They only had 222 seats. That was a very thin margin. So they did not have that many seats to lose. That's one thing that people were not taken into account. A lot of these models, except one, which I will mention in a moment, Alan Abramowitz from Emory University, He's a very good forecaster. He's been very good forecasting presidential elections, and this time he did a very good job forecasting the midterm election. He estimated 19 seats. Now, he still overshot the mark, but he came the closest. And what he did was he looked at what was the membership in the House, and the other variable was what was the congressional. When you ask people whom do you intend to vote, I think it's called when you ask people whom would you expect, whom would you like to see in Congress, people respond, and it was very close, about 1 point or 2 points off difference. So based on those two variables alone, he estimated that the Democrats would lose 19 seats. I think they've lost, according to the latest count I saw today, they've only lost maybe 11 seats. So they haven't lost very many seats really. But and there's still one. The Republicans still one more seat to lose to gain control of the House, and they're expected to gain control of the House maybe in the next couple of days. So much for the horse race, if you will. But there are a couple of other interesting things that came out of the election. One is that there was the shift. Again, it's only the margins. It's only a shift. But the Democrats still have a majority of the vote in Black voters, so-called Hispanic voters, and Asian voters. So all those ethnic groups still vote, a majority of them, according to the exit polls, still voted for the Democrats. However, there was a shift to the Republicans. And this goes contrary to a lot of the conventional wisdom. In fact, it all began in 2016. There was a small but measurable shift to Trump in 2016. That kind of flew in the face of a lot of a lot of expectations, and it was actually made stronger in 2020, and now it continues in 2022. So there's something interesting how that's a very interesting phenomenon. I didn't see about the Jewish vote. I'm not gonna speak from memory because I looked at the exit polls, but I don't remember about the Jewish vote. But that would be another interesting one if there was a shift, which I can't say. Maybe one of my colleagues can tell me that. So that's the second interesting thing. And of course, then the big story, of course, that everybody's talking about is Florida, right? There was a red wave in Florida, as everybody knows. But also there was another wave in New York. Surprisingly enough, certain parts of New York voted Republican. That had not been expected. It was kind of a surprise again that they voted for the Republican. Again, they picked up, I think it was like 4 seats in New York, which is you wouldn't expect that in New York. So I think those are the two interesting things. Then you have Ohio, where the Republicans did very well, but the news were the good news for the Republicans were scarce. Florida, Ohio, and a little bit in New York, which was kind of surprising. It's just a marginal thing anyway in New York. So now we're still waiting for Georgia and see what happens there. But so, and I guess the last thing I will mention is that former President Trump, did not do well in his predictions and his endorsements. The only permanent endorsement that won election was Vance in Ohio. But probably any more or less decent Republican would have won in Ohio, because every other like the governor won handily, and so. If there had not been some kind of crazy guy running in Ohio, more than likely the Republicans would have won there too. So I don't think the endorsement helped Vance in the primary, but I don't think it did that much good for him in the general election.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kuzan. Dr. Ramsey, if you would please give us your insight. And again, I want to remind the audience members that as you're listening to the panelists, if questions are coming to you, go ahead, click on the Q&A box down towards the bottom of your screen and go ahead and enter your questions so we will have plenty of questions for the Q&A session. Okay, Dr. Ramsey.
Yeah, I was trying to think, what can I say that Dr. Kuzan hasn't already said? I'll focus on the law. That's a good thing to do. So one thing I was paying attention to was that how we vote has changed. When we vote, what's considered election, it's no longer election day, but election season. And when I'm trying to figure out sort of what explains how these elections went, I think there's evidence that changes to voting laws in several states during COVID have given Democrats an advantage. They have a better get out the vote effort and have been very successful in sort of using, in some states, ballot harvesting and really getting locked in early mail-in ballots that will be counted. And that might be sort of if you're the party that's progressive and looking to the future, it would make sense that you be tuned into what's happening right now and what's changed. And if you're a conservative party, you might be slow to catch on to how things have changed since the last election. You might pay consultants who are say, don't worry, we know how these things go, and we're on top. And really, it looks like Republicans, the country over, not prepared for how voting habits, how turnout has changed, and when voters are locking in their votes. The other interesting thing, I'm sure more stuff will come out, but I was interested to see how few candidates, national candidates, would debate, and that's of course a troubling sign that if we don't have candidates who are willing to sort of air their views and disagree with each other, stake out positions, commit to a platform in advance of voters casting their ballots, that's a real breakdown in how the system should work. There should be an opportunity for voters to hear the differences between candidates, what the theories of the race are, and then cast their vote, and that gives a real mandate. So when we have, I think back to the last election, we see all these changes in foreign policy that are going on, and we didn't have a foreign policy debate, and I wish we would have had one. That would have been a nice thing to know where Biden and Trump stood. And here also, I think just things are going to be so close in the Senate and the House now. It would be nice to know where candidates stand on the issues, and not just speaking to their base, but how they respond to questions. Maybe giving them the opportunity to question each other and show how they hold up under other theories of the case, how they would explain themselves to the opposition. That would be a healthy thing, and I was very discouraged to see how few debates took place.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ramsey. Dr. Shively, would you go ahead and please give us a little bit of your insight?
Sure. I'll focus a little bit on foreign policy implications, and then a grab bag of small observations. Since I'm not an Americanist, this is just sort of my my informed opinion on those. But on foreign policy, one thing we were looking for was whether or not the Republicans would have a big win, because some of them were raising some issues about Ukraine and how much the Biden administration has been spending on the Ukraine war. Now, maybe if it was Trump was president, maybe he'd be doing the same thing. That's a different discussion. But certainly that was going to be up for debate. And I think that Ukraine aid is probably not going to be under threat now because the Republican majority will be thin enough that there will probably be, and they're kind of divided on this issue. So we'll probably see that support continue. And I think I mentioned that partly because that's a big symbolic issue right now for international affairs and U.S. foreign policy. It really represents where the U.S. may be going in the world. And then some on the GOP side, for instance, have said we shouldn't be spending anymore. So it's a good symbolic issue. Another representative issue would be China and U.S. competition with China. Does the change in composition will that affect Congress's disposition toward U.S. trade with China and so forth? And again, I think we'll probably see pretty much continuity on this. As Dr. Ramsey said, we didn't have a good foreign policy debate during the last presidential election. Which is unfortunate because in some ways Biden has carried forward some of Trump's approaches and completely thrown over others. But the parties do seem to be fairly consistent on their desire to confront China and in this case confront Russia. So we're probably not going to see a lot of change. So basically on foreign policy, sometimes you will see a big shift because Congress has the levers of the foreign policy budget. But in this case, I don't think we can expect too much, except I would expect that the House is now going to investigate the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan. So next year, so I think that'll be something to watch for, and that may bring foreign policy back into the political debate. Now, regarding just a few quick hits on the election itself and American politics, One argument I'll make is that there's a Trump effect on the vote and on polling, which is to say Trump, I think, attracts people who don't normally respond to polls, but he'll bring them out to vote, but only when he's on the ticket. So like the polls were a little off in 2016 and 2020, but a little more accurate for the 2018 midterm and this midterm. And it may be that he just has a kind of unique effect on the voting public. Now, what that also does, though, is mobilize a lot of folks against him, right? There was a huge turnout, and Biden got the edge in 2020. So I think that's something that Republicans are looking at as they look forward, as Trump has just announced that he'll be running for president, that he does seem to have this kind of unusual effect on the voting public. But that's just my take. My colleagues may agree or disagree with that. It's also worth noting, and this is just sort of the conventional read, I think, at this point, that there were some issues that affected turnout, like if abortion was on the ballot in some states, and or voter integrity, that sort of thing, those sort of laws and policies. Florida went strongly for Republicans, partly because DeSantis looked at abortion and said, I'm not going to touch that right now. And I think that probably helped him where it may have hurt Republicans in other states. One other minor note, and then I'll hand it off, which is I think that Democrats may enjoy a small advantage in these midterms going forward because more educated people tend to come out to vote in midterms, and folks with college degrees and so forth. And that population has shifted quite a bit from leaning Republican to leaning Democrat. So in midterm elections, it may be that there's a kind of structural advantage. Whereas Dr. Kuzan said some groups, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and so on, are shifting a little bit toward Republicans on the margins. At the same time, educated voters are shifting toward Democrats, and that may cancel that out or balance it out. So those are just my initial thoughts, observations to add to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Shively. And finally, Dr. Caton, would you please give us your thoughts on what we've been witnessing here?
You bet. Hi, everybody. So one observation goes along with some of what Dr. Shively said, is that what is a bit abnormal this year in that it goes against recent trends and back towards more historical trends is that there were large state level effects in the midterm election results. The U.S. electorate has become increasingly nationalized over the last few decades, meaning, every state and county in the country, for the most part, swings the same way. Presidential voting is becoming more and more correlated with voting for other offices. And that had become steadily more and more the case over the last several decades. And in this recent election, we saw, New York and Florida shifting strongly in the Republican direction, not enough to bring Republicans to power in New York, but much better performance by them than usual. And then places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Oklahoma shifting in the Democratic direction, not enough to bring Democrats to power in Oklahoma and Ohio, but more than usual. So you have different states going different ways, and the effects do seem to map onto state borders really well. So it's not House districts, it's not local effects, it's something statewide. And Dr. Shively identified what seemed to be the major issues there, which is that when abortion was on the ballot, either directly or indirectly, that gave Democrats an advantage. By directly, I mean, was there a ballot measure directly related to the right to abortion, either protecting it or restricting it? And in all cases, there seemed to be a coattail effect for those ballot measures. Democrats did better in elections up and down the ballot when those were on the ballot. And then the other statewide effect, and so those are direct measures. Indirect measures would be if unified control of the state government would give Republicans the power to pass more restrictive abortion laws, or if a gubernatorial candidate had said they were going to do so, Democrats did better. That tended to not benefit Republicans. The other statewide effect was about election security. Put scare quotes around that if you like, where Republican candidates who parroted Trump's claims that the 2020 election was stolen from him, which was, used to justify what I think can accurately be called an attempted coup d'etat. The Republicans did worse up and down the ballot, and those candidates in particular did worse. And that tended to hurt Republicans statewide, and explains a lot of the differences in Senate candidates. Those effects were much greater in gubernatorial elections and Senate elections than they were in House elections. And I believe there might be one exception, but I believe all of the candidates running for governor or secretary of state that believed or claimed the 2020 election was stolen lost, at least in battleground states. And if candidates who didn't make such claims won. So that's one big takeaway. There seemed to be state level policy issues that had big effects, nudging states away from the typical midterm electoral pattern, which is interesting and is historically normal, but not normal by according to recent history. Let's see. Another interesting takeaway, again, related to Dr. Shively and Dr. Cusan's points, is there's conventional wisdom that Democrats have a structural disadvantage in legislative elections because their voters are inefficiently distributed across districts, because Republicans attract more support from rural and suburban voters, and Democrats from urban voters. You have more highly uncompetitive Democratic districts, or you have a lot of highly uncompetitive Democratic districts where the Democratic incumbents are safe, but there aren't enough of those districts to get close to a majority, and then Republicans can win by smaller margins in more districts. And so there's the conventional wisdom as recently as a couple of years ago was that Democrats needed you saw claims that they needed a 3 or 4 point popular vote margin to win a majority in the House of Representatives. And that seems like it's not actually the case for some of the reasons that Dr. Shively and Dr. Cusan addressed. And I'm actually working on a research project right now on ideology in Congress, the stuff I'm always going on about in class. And one of the interesting things we found is that over the last 10 years, the number of Americans who call themselves conservatives has actually gone down by a pretty substantial amount. And there's another conventional wisdom that in American politics, it's a center-right country where most people think of themselves as conservative and are generally sympathetic to conservative attitudes. but there are a lot of liberal policy positions that are also very popular. And so Democrats campaign on popular policy, but they're never advertising the fact that they're liberals. They just talk about policies people like, and conservatives are advertising the fact, or Republicans advertise the fact that they are conservative to tap into the more popular identity that people have and general outlook. And conservatism is much more common in rural than urban areas. So what a co-author and I have found is that over the last 20 years, but in particular over the last 10 years, the clear majority of the public that calls itself conservative has vanished, that it's basically 50-50 now. And a lot of the public still identifies as, or still supports liberal policy positions, which means the structural foundation of a Republican House majority has started to erode. So it used to be the case that Republicans could win a majority in the House by only appealing to districts where most voters were conservatives, and they didn't need to pick up any liberal districts, and that Democrats could only win House majority if they won liberal districts and flipped conservative districts. But as of the last 4 years or so, that's no longer the case. Democrats can win a majority only by picking up liberal districts, because more districts, a lot of these suburban districts that have flipped during the Trump administration have become liberal, not just in supporting Democrats, but the people who live there are actually more likely to call themselves liberal than they used to be, and to think of themselves as liberal. So so Democrats now, think of it as they have a higher floor. They can just about get a majority in the House by only winning liberal districts, and they don't need to flip very many conservative ones. Whereas Republicans need to win conservative districts and are more likely to need to flip some liberal districts too in order to win. So the tables have kind of turned on the parties. And so the parties are trading voters a bit. It's like a very small realignment where Republicans are doing a little bit better among Black, Asian, Latino, and perhaps Jewish Americans. I know there's tremendous diversity within all three of those categories. Democrats are doing a bit better among educated suburban folks. But Republicans are picking up voters that were part of those groups who were inefficiently distributed across districts, and Democrats are picking up more voters that were contributing to Republicans' structural advantages. So it's a trade that, at least in the short term and in legislative elections, seems to benefit Democrats more than Republicans, which partially perhaps explains last week's results. Let's see. I have a million things I could talk about, but I will leave time for questions.
All right. Thank you. Don't get too comfortable, Dr. Kate. I'm throwing this first question back at you. So we've gotten a lot of good questions here, and I think we're gonna start with just talking about Florida a little bit. So we have a question here about the red wave in Florida that Dr. Kuzan brought up, and we have a question about maybe how seriously the Democrats attempted to do well in Florida. That there's been criticisms that when you look at the elections that the Democrats ran in Florida, they were frankly lackluster. We didn't see a lot of advertisement, maybe not necessarily a high level of spending. So does this play a role? The fact that it seemed like the Democrats weren't necessarily trying very hard in Florida, is that playing a role here, or something else going on in Florida? So I'm going to pass this off to Dr. Caton and the other panelists. You guys are more than welcome to jump in on these questions as well.
Yeah, I think the campaign and campaign spending plays a fairly small role. Candidate quality plays a modest-sized role, but I don't know that was an issue in Florida necessarily. And this is the second election cycle in a row, or midterm cycle in a row in Florida, where the senatorial candidates and the gubernatorial candidates of the same party got virtually the same vote share. So the we didn't have a big split like Mike DeWine. We talked about Ohio earlier. Mike DeWine, the governor of Ohio, got 62% of the vote in Ohio, and J.D. Vance, the Trump-endorsed Senate candidate, only got 53% of the vote in Ohio. That's a huge gap, right? A lot of people are showing up to vote for Mike DeWine and not for J.D. Vance. But in Florida, Rubio and DeSantis got nearly identical shares of the vote. There wasn't a big split. So that to me suggests it's not merely a question of candidates. It's not merely a question of campaigns, unless, Rubio and DeSantis were both running better ones than their opponents. But I think there are some other things at work here. So campaigns affect election results at the margins. They have small effects, but in a close race, small effects decide the outcome. So campaigns are still important. But in Florida, I think a few things besides that are going on. One is that the population of Florida is just becoming more Republican. I don't know if it's more Republicans moving to Florida from other states. The Latino population in Florida is disproportionately Republican. Cubans and Venezuelans in particular, who are more likely because of their distinctive experiences and terrible things that have happened under left-wing regimes in both of their countries, are more likely to gravitate towards the Republican Party, which is so they're outpacing that shift among Latino voters in other states. Part of it also has to do with, or potentially has to do with, COVID response. So DeSantis's response to COVID was very popular in Florida. His not very much in the way of restrictions, not very much in the way of school closures, and that sort of thing was very popular here, and was sometimes at odds with the national response. The response in New York was much stricter and was far less popular. And in both cases, the governor is the lightning rod, is the focal point for that policy response. So I think among some voters, I don't know how many, but certainly among some, you're seeing COVID backlash, or whatever the opposite of a backlash is, and that could be part of it. So in Florida, for instance, DeSantis has been more moderate on abortion than some other Republicans. He's backed a 15-week abortion ban, but not a complete abortion ban. That's a more moderate position than other governors. And as a result, there seemed to be less counter-mobilization than other governors experienced. It's hard to answer questions like this because there's only one election outcome and there are dozens of possible explanations for it. And so in statistics, you call that a degrees of freedom problem. We have more variables than we have data points. So you can kind of tell whatever story you want and they're all plausible. But I would caution, it's not just campaigns.
I'll throw out one related observation here, which was simply that, and it's not really an explanation, but I saw a political scientist at FSU, I think, who pointed out that the Democratic turnout in strong Democratic counties really cratered. They didn't show up. So they showed up in much lower numbers, and at the same time, Republicans came out in higher numbers than 2020 or 2018. I don't remember what the comparison was. So, I agree with everything Dr. Caton said. For whatever reason, it wasn't just that Republican, I don't know how many people may have switched to voting Republican so much as Republicans came out in force. There are more Republicans in Florida than there used to be. And at the same time, Democrats just didn't show up. And there might be different reasons for that. But I think we would imagine probably closer votes in 2 years in the presidential election. It'll probably still lean Republican, but it'll probably be a closer vote at that time.
I have a question for Dr. Kreischer. when you mentioned the shift away from the conservatives, people self-described conservatives, does that include this election?
Dr. Caton, I'm pretty sure that's for you.
Yeah, it's for Caton. Yeah.
It doesn't. The measure I'm using for that is the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. So the data is only up through the 2020 election season.
Okay.
And
it's
been recently in the field.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because the Wall Street Journal, I saw the exit poll there, and I didn't see that there. But I'm only speaking from memory. But you might want to look. I'll send you. Well, you can get it yourself, but I can. You have the exit poll numbers for this election?
Not handy.
Yeah, no, I don't have me right now, but you have access to them. Have you seen them yet?
Some of them, yeah. I'm a little skeptical. I mean, like Dr. Ramsey was talking about, the way people are voting is changing. I'm not sure that the way exit polls are conducted have kept up with that. And so as we see partisan and demographic differences by the mode of voting, I'm not sure, if exit polls are still disproportionately in person and election day, they're going to have probably a Republican lean that they didn't in the past. Some exit pollsters might have accounted for that and others haven't. I think the quality varies, and I haven't kept up with which ones are good and which ones aren't.
All right, so keeping on the topic of the red wave, we have a really good question here in terms of the expectations of the red wave. Do you think the public's expectation for a red wave in the midterms, did it maybe cause a bit of complacency in red voters at all, or maybe helped spur Democrats into action, causing the expected red wave to be smaller? Or was this just an example of the actual wave size being more or less what was reasonably expected? So did maybe the media playing up the red wave, did that maybe hold back Republicans in some states and maybe help them in other states? So I'll leave that as an open question for the panel.
I'll jump in since everybody's quiet, and I don't actually know the answer, but I'll do my best. I'm skeptical that it had too much of an effect. I mean, sometimes there's a media narrative about an election that comes completely true, and sometimes they're wrong. And, so I don't know that we can consistently say building up one candidate means they're doomed. But it might have had some effect on the ticket splitting that happened. If Republicans thought their party was going to do well regardless, that might have caused them to leave the ballot blank for candidates they didn't like because they thought maybe the candidate would win anyway and they didn't feel like voting for them. That's speculation, though. I'm not sure.
By the way, another question for Dr. Caton. I think I saw a reference today or yesterday, some claim that more Republicans, the Republicans got more votes overall than Democrats. Is that true this time around?
Probably. The votes haven't all been counted yet in California, so the apparent gap now will come down. But it looks like, Republicans, if you add up all the House races, Republicans got more votes. I mean, you have to be a bit careful with those numbers because it's best practices to impute the results of uncontested races. So, there were plenty of races where there was only a Republican or only a Democrat on the ballot, in which case the Republicans in those districts, if there were only Democrats on the ballot, wouldn't have had their votes counted in the popular vote total. So a lot of analysts take the election results and then sort of guesstimate what the popular vote would have been in a district that only had one party on the ballot. That work hasn't been done yet, but that's sort of an elaborate way of saying I still think, yes, there were more total votes for Republicans in House races.
The other thing that nobody has yet mentioned is the Democrats nominating Charlie Crist for governor. I don't know why they would do something like that. That would be that was a very strange. Not that I don't know that anybody would have done any better, but why Crist? Can anybody explain to me why Crist?
I have it. I suspected. Yeah, it surprised me too. But my best guess was um, Democrats were feeling threatened, and so they figured the best option they had against a strong Republican would be another Republican, basically, a Republican adjacent. Um, it's sort of the logic of in the 2020 election, if you've got Trump running, maybe you don't want to run a big leftist. You want to run somebody like Biden, who has more of a reputation of being more, traditional or something. So that was my, off the cuff theory, because the Democrats made that decision, right? Democratic voters. So they must have been thinking in terms, and those voters do think in terms of electability. So that would be a plausible thought process for them. But yeah, because it was financed on both sides in that primary.
Dr. Ramsey spoke of electoral law, and I'm wondering if we could, shift in that direction a little bit. For example, Georgia is going to have a runoff election, and I'm wondering whether more states should adopt a runoff when no candidate receives an absolute majority of the vote in an election, or maybe the parties could do that for the primary. I think one of the problems that we have is that in the primary vote, oftentimes the vote is so split that someone with a quarter of the vote or a third of the vote then becomes a nominee. And then the other thing is, like, for example, in Alaska now, they have this ranked order voting, which is popular in some, in Australia and other countries, but not in the U.S. We're been trying now in New York City, now Alaska, I believe. Another New England state was also trying it out. So I don't know, Dr. Caton, if you have any, have you looked into that at all, and how it's affecting nominations and elections?
I haven't really looked into it, to be honest. I think it's potentially very important, but I haven't done any real research.
And do you think it would be a good idea to have runoffs like in Georgia?
Personally, I kind of like it, but that's just a matter of personal preference. I like the legitimacy of, if we're going to have elections, I like the legitimacy of the majority winning. I didn't say if we're going to have elections to insinuate that I don't want to have elections, but I think if we're, anyway, I'm in favor of elections, and I'm in favor of the majority being able to decide who wins elections.
Well, I think Dr. Kuzan hints at something that's a completely different discussion that we shouldn't get off on too much, which is the primary system seems to have gone a little off the rails. It's out of the control of the parties. It's kind of out of the control of the voters. As he said, very small. Sometimes it doesn't take much of a percentage of the vote to carry it. So that it's kind of entrenched, but I think most people agree it's kind of become a different creature than what it was intended to be. One thing I'll add, I was thinking about the red wave thing. Now that I've had a chance to process it in media influence, it's probably worth restating Dr. Caton's earlier point that states seem to matter a lot in what issues and candidates were performing in given states. So if the red wave was kind of suppressed by media coverage and hype, you would probably see that as a national phenomenon. But the variation was more, it seems, based on different states, right, and the issues and the candidates in those different states. So there may have been some kind of media effect, a hype effect, but the more relevant variable seems to have been other factors. And for what it's, I'll stop there.
So in terms of this discussion of the waves, so maybe not necessarily just talking about the red wave, one of the things that a couple of you have noted is that we actually could argue we had a blue wave here and there, whether Pennsylvania, my home state of Michigan, had a pretty significant blue wave over the election. But in terms of just waves in general, not necessarily blue wave or red wave, should we see should we see these as blips on the electoral radar, or does this point to maybe long term, right? So how long should we expect sort of Florida to remain as red as it is? How long should we expect Michigan to remain as blue as that is? So is it a blip in the radar, or are we seeing more long-term trends in some of these states?
I'll jump in on this. I'll try to keep it short. But one way we could approach it, in some ways, the election isn't going to be remembered. Rather, it's what's accomplished as a consequence of the election. What changes in our politics? Are there changes to the law? Are the parties themselves sort of, Dr. Caton mentioned the realignment that's probably underway in some form. There's a sort of sifting out that's going on, and people aren't voting the way we thought they would. But maybe, you sort of have to wait and see what did happen as a consequence of this election. What, are there going to be new voting coalitions that form? Is it possible to see movement within state legislatures on issues like the abortion issue? The court has handed that back to the states now. Are states going to move behind a 15-week prohibition on abortion? Will they move further in to give access to partial birth abortions? At that level, to be interesting. At the national level, is it possible to get more things done given a pretty closely divided House and Senate? Or do we just see more deadlock and it has to break one way or the other before anything can really be accomplished? But maybe that's the more political science. Maybe the media way of talking about it is there was a wave, it was red or it was blue or it was mixed, and the political sciencey way is like, well, what's going to happen because of this and what caused it, and so I do think a big, to speak also to Dr. Kuzan's question about runoffs, that maybe the media would prefer to have an election night, an event that they can lead up to and they can pump for a month, and then there's a big night and it's like the Super Bowl of politics, and it's a lot less satisfying for ratings and all that to have we don't really know what's going to happen. It's going to be a few weeks. Just we'll get back to you. Results are still coming in, and so that takes some of the influence out of the hands of the media. They're already fairly unpopular with both sides of the electorate right now, and puts it in the hands of political actors, right, and the voters. So those are things that I see going on, and I'm just not sure how helpful it is to sort of either try to activate a voter base or chill one by labeling or predicting some kind of wave or another.
You don't think the media would actually like to have a runoff? They would actually extend the excitement further another 4 weeks. They no sooner as the midterm over, they start talking about 2024. So they could actually talk about the next 4 weeks. I don't even know you need 4 weeks, but two, maybe two is too soon. I'm gonna have to see what France does. I don't think France takes 4 weeks. They might take a little less. In France, they have a runoff if no candidate wins, not only for the presidency but also for the congressional districts, for the assembly districts. If nobody wins a majority, they have to go. They have to a second round, and we could start with the primaries. Let the parties decide. In fact, if we did that, not to mention names, but some candidates, who have a strong 25 to 30% base, they may not be able to obtain a majority once the other parties, once the other candidates sort of drop off. And I don't know what the Republicans would do in 2024, but one of the things that they did last time, they were so divided. What were they, 16 candidates at one point, and now already you're talking about Pompeo thinking they're going to run, Pence is thinking about going to run. There's going to be, so I think it would be good, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party both, for that matter. I think they would do well to begin at the state level, just to see how it goes. One of the things about somebody mentioned not long ago, I read an article that says that, states were supposed to be one interpretation of state politics was that they were laboratories of democracy, that we could start doing some things at the state level, and then if it worked, it could be imitated by other states. Well, I think that's what they're trying to do with the ranked order voting, or the preferential ballot, as they call it. And so that's what, maybe we should try that in Florida. Maybe we should try to talk the parties into having runoffs just for the primary and see how that goes.
Let me jump in on that. Sorry, but and just to say, a thing that concerns me is seeing since 2000 that people who lose elections tend to think that there's fraud, right? And that's not good in a democracy. For the losing part of the voting populace to think that the only way my side could lose is if there was fraud going on. And so something that is healthy under those conditions is to have robust discussion of what a legitimate election would look like, and to realize that there can be changes to how we hold elections and for that experimentation to take place. And because of things happening, I always see things through the eyes of the court, because of changes that have been made at the level of the Supreme Court, there is now more freedom for states to experiment with how they run their elections. And there's also, if you recall, the first bill the Democrats wanted to put forward after 2020 was a federal law about what legitimate elections look like. To make things sort of the same everywhere. And I don't think that kind of experimentation and discussion and then analysis is a bad thing. I think it's a sign of healthy sort of like participation. I think voting rates are up in recent years. More people are voting and more often. So all that looks like maybe signs of health in the country rather than something to be concerned about.
Dr. Ramsey, I'm going to go ahead and put words in your mouth and say I appreciate the fact that you are behind my crusade for making Intro to Comparative Politics a requirement for all students, so we can learn about all these different electoral systems and see how they're supposed to operate. So I appreciate your support in that. So another question. So Dr. Caton, I know you said we have a degrees of freedom problem here with one election, but I'm going to go ahead and push it even further. So we've been talking about maybe some of the legislative issues or the court cases that might have been impacting, whether it's abortion or other issues impacting this particular election. Could there have possibly been an impact of January 6th and what happened with the 2020 election? Did that maybe hang over the midterms as well? And could that have had a little bit of an impact on what we saw?
Yes, I think so. And I think so in a couple of ways. On the one hand, this is a very depressing topic to me, but that's all right. So on the one hand, there's a struggle happening within the Republican Party for control of the party between former President Trump and basically people who don't want him to be the face of the party. And he endorsed a bunch of candidates, congressional candidates and state level candidates and Senate candidates. And one of the things the candidates he endorsed have in common is that they tend to repeat the lie that the 2020 election was stolen. And they also, and this is why this is particularly salient in state level races, is they were running for offices as a governor and secretary of state, where they would be in charge of implementing election laws. And so what happened in a lot of these races is that the candidates he endorsed end up losing. I was looking at some analysis, and it seems like a Trump endorsement carried a 5-point penalty in the general election. help these candidates win the primaries, but then cost them in the general election. And, this is what depresses me about this, is that there's such a stark partisan division on the interpretation of this. So Republicans seem to be, based on opinion polls, somewhat divided between thinking that the election actually was stolen and that we are currently living under an illegitimate administration, and thinking that it's actually not a big deal. People are overreacting. People went into Nancy Pelosi's office. So what? Kind of attitude. And however, to Democrats and to more independents than not, January 6th was more like it was in some ways like a 9/11 type moment, but without the casualties. But in terms of its disturbing implications, it's very disturbing, because, you had a sitting president of the United States using multiple strategies to try to stay in power, many of those strategies illegal. The January 6th attack on the Capitol being the most visible one, but frankly, he asked the vice president not to not count election results from battleground states. That's unconstitutional. If he remains in power by breaking the Constitution, that's a coup. And this, so for a lot of independents and Democrats, they've spent the last, couple of years with their heads exploding that this is not a bigger deal to more people. So I think Republicans don't appreciate the level of freak out that's happening among Democrats, because if you'd asked most of them, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever, would Republicans even consider accepting the endorsement of someone who had done this, Democrats would have said, no, they wouldn't do that. But it turns out most of them will. And then you have candidates, the Republican gubernatorial candidate in Wisconsin, who underperformed the Senate candidate quite a bit, said that if he won, Democrats would never win another statewide election in Wisconsin. So think about what that sounds like to Democrats living in Wisconsin. So I think that drives it a lot, and it had a couple of effects. One, it caused Republicans to nominate some pretty weak candidates in a lot of states. These candidates underperformed because this position is really not popular. It doesn't really mobilize Republicans, and it mobilizes Democrats and a lot of independents against it. That's one effect on the results, which is, may precipitate a power struggle within the Republican Party, or it may not. I don't know. Party civil wars are often prophesied and rarely actually arrive. So that's one effect which drives the results. I think it's going to affect the divisions within the parties going forward. And I think it has a lot to do with Democratic resilience in some places, and in a lot of the states where Democrats did really well, or better than you would have expected, places like Pennsylvania and Arizona. This was a factor, one of many possible factors, but it's a big one. So I don't know if that adequately answers the question, but it's part of it, I think. What I think, and I guess one final point is it's interesting that at least among members of Congress, I'm always paying attention to the way members of Congress react to this sort of thing. And among members of Congress, there seems to be much more open criticism of President Trump coming from congressional Republicans. And, there are these, what I tend to think are mostly right, but also kind of oversimplistic theories of congressional politics, which is that they only care about winning. They only care about, winning the majority, or we can understand a lot of their behavior on those terms. And, I always kind of think, that there's a lot to that, but it's gotta be over simplified. But then, Trump loses in 2020, but Republicans gained House seats, and they weren't, and the Republican House caucus wasn't that upset with him. And then in 2022, his endorsements likely cost them the Senate after, I believe, costing them. I think you could argue that Trump directly cost the Republicans 4 Senate seats while he was in office. I think you can lay the blame at both Arizona and Georgia Senate seats at his feet personally. And then costing them the chance of retaking the Senate this election, almost costing them a chance of retaking the House. And it's interesting that is what has provoked Republicans in Congress to say, yeah, he shouldn't run again. We don't want him to lead the party anymore. I don't know. I think it's a good day for the political scientists David Mayhew and Francis Lee, who say that this is really all members of Congress care about, because it seems to be the case to me.
All right, so let's shift our attention maybe a little to moving forward. And Dr. Ramsey, we have a question that kind of goes back to a point you raised, and that was the sort of new tradition following elections of claiming fraud. And the only reason why I lost is because there must have been cheating. And at least in terms of what we've seen thus far with the midterm election, we're not seeing a whole lot of that. We're seeing a lot of folks exit relatively gracefully, not claiming fraud and cheating and things like that, with some of the exception of what we've seen in Arizona. So do you think this bodes well moving forward? Are we maybe switching to beyond what happened in 2020? Maybe we're going back to sort of losing with grace, and does this have potentially impacts on maybe we don't see the level of political violence following elections that we saw in 2020?
Let's see. Political violence is bad. Exploding heads are bad. It's not good that apparently per Dr. Caton's analysis, Donald Trump is the cause of much ill in American politics. All right, who knows? I'm not in the prediction business, so I'm really not sure. That's just the truth. But we'll see, right? Yeah, so let's pay attention and see.
Yeah, I think individual, there's a political leaders have more of an effect on public opinion than people realize, I think. And I think it matters a lot whether the political culture of politicians, is inclined to attribute all defeats to fraud or to accept them when they come. So I don't think, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't say that this is, entirely like this tendency is entirely President Trump's fault. I mean, if you look at opinion polls after elections, the party that loses a presidential election, their supporters and the public for a little while after the election do tend to mostly think the election was stolen. That was true of Democrats in 2004 and 2000 and in 1988. It goes all the way back. So it's not the case that it's only Republicans or that it's what I think was unique about this. So there's this appetite for believing that your losses are illegitimate because nobody wants to find out they're wrong and that most of the public doesn't support the same candidates they support. That doesn't make you wrong, but nobody wants to find out that their preferred view is unpopular. So if you look at opinion polls, it's do you think votes in the election were counted correctly? The losing party always says no, and the winning party always says yes. And 2020 was a little bit more extreme in that regard, but not a lot. What is different is that American political elites are very careful not to tap into that sentiment most of the time, and certainly not presidents and presidential candidates. That's the thing that's relatively new. So I think it really matters that elites are careful and only bring accusations of fraud when they really think it happened. And I totally agree with Dr. Ramsey. Like, changing the way elections work to instill public confidence and experimenting with that is obviously I think that's a wonderful thing to do. Right. It's not quite the same thing.
The other thing on the people who shout fraud, right? Even that's a sign of health compared to one other step, which is where nobody even mentions it anymore because they know the system is rigged, right? That's where you really don't want to be. That's a truly dangerous place for a regime, a popular regime. And so it is. There's still signs for it. It's okay that people are speaking out about when they do about their concerns about elections not being on the up and up. And the best way to respond is to, as much as possible, try to show concern for the people who think it's illegitimate, and to try to be as transparent as possible, to invite election watchers in, to pronounce and promulgate the rules, make sure that those rules are enforced, and that when there is any kind of impropriety detected, that it's punished, right? There's a prompt response to it, to instill trust in people who are not very trusting. And that decline in trust is probably pretty bad for a regime like ours. When we just don't trust most things that we're told, I don't think that's a good thing. We can question, right? But there's got to be some level of trust of your fellow citizen and of the form of government you have, the elected officials who represent you once they do win an election. So at least we haven't gotten to the point where people silently take in the results of an election, and when they feel like it was wrong, they don't even speak up because they just know it's rigged. Like, that would be really bad if that were where we were as a country.
One thing I'll add here is that I do feel somewhat optimistic. I've gone from pessimistic or alarmed at the prominence of this rhetoric to feeling somewhat optimistic, because the reality is, no matter how much you challenge these results, sometime in a lot of these elections, the U.S. system, first of all, is not a single system. It's a bunch of different states at the local level, and almost all of these people are very reliable professionals who take their job seriously. Most poll workers are very serious about what they're doing. And, bottom line is the votes are reliable. There are very, vanishingly small numbers of cases of fraud and so forth. So that helps, with that legitimacy that Dr. Ramsey was talking about, is that even though people, or the frustration that Dr. Caden was talking about, after a bad loss, people will just want to think somehow it was rigged. But the votes are reliable, and no matter how much you push on it and take it to the courts and so forth, they do come out as reliable. There's just no systematic evidence anywhere that's really a problem. So spend some quality time with our local county elections official, David Stafford, and you'll get some idea of what I'm talking about here. It's not treated as a political issue typically. It's treated as like a technical, professional thing to manage. And there's lots of people. There are lots of procedures already in place for observation and so forth. So most of these claims get people spun up, but they don't really go anywhere substantively because there's just nowhere to go.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it reminds me of another consistent finding in polling year after year where people, even when they express skepticism of the legitimacy of the outcome of an election or the integrity of the count of the vote, they tend to be very confident that their vote was counted accurately and that the results were counted accurately in their precinct or their county. So people have a much higher opinion of their local election officials than election officials elsewhere in the country. It's always distant, right? The election officials in some distant place where the other party is in control is always the culprit. And there are plenty of examples of both parties doing that. And employing that rhetoric. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to, I think that's a pretty good system overall.
You know, I think one of the I'm not sure about this, but I think one of the reasons that you see some suspicion is the large number of mail-in ballots. There's a good number. There's a good concern from many quarters that this mail-in ballots is subject to or vulnerable to fraud. What do you all think about that? I am old enough to kind of I look back to the days when everybody voted on election day, and very few people would actually vote early, let alone mail-in ballots. And all of a sudden, Dr. Ramsey was talking about this. That the whole voting system, the habits and the culture has changed rapidly in just a couple of election cycles. And so I think when you have hundreds of thousands of votes mailed in, and they come in days after the election, I think that's what that's what a lot of what Republicans in this case they tend to say, well, my guy was ahead, and then all of a sudden, one remembers machine politics, and there was an old story attributed to Major Daley, Richard Daley of Chicago. And I don't know if this is true or not. It could be apocryphal, but the story went that Kennedy was elected in 1960, largely because, aside from what went on in Alabama, but in Chicago, apparently Daley held back a couple of precincts. He wanted to know how many votes had been cast in Southern Illinois before he released the votes in Chicago. And he said, how many voted over there in Southern Illinois? Once they got the vote, then he released some votes, and who knows, whether there was any hanky-panky there. The implication was that some votes were manufactured to bring Kennedy over the top. And so those kinds of things are the kind of thing that a lot of people get suspicious. And I think this would actually might be allayed if something was done about this huge number of mail-in ballots. I know that in Pennsylvania, I think I read, I don't know if it's true or not, but you never can be too sure what you read in the media. But I read in the media that the Fetterman camp, when they were still very close and they thought maybe they might lose, they went to court to sue to count mail-in ballots that were undated. So presumably that would violate the law. You have to date the ballot, then you have to actually sign it. And how much control is really exercised on this kind of mail-in ballots? So anyway, I just throw that in to see if any of you would have some answer to that, and anything that could be done to make the reduce the number of mail-in ballots and actually get a better control and better transparency, that better assurance to people like the professional I saw the other day that mail-in ballots are not to be so suspect.
I have one comment. It might be sort of silly, but I'll throw it out there anyway. And that is, right after the election, there was a story that hit some national media about a crash in a cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, and as the stories have come out about sort of what was being done there, it became clear that we're just not quite sure what cryptocurrency is and how to regulate it exactly. Like, it's a new thing on the scene. And in the same way, whenever anything's new, right? When something changes, when cell phones came along, right? And then we realized, you probably shouldn't use those when you're driving. When new things happen, it takes a while for us to step in and decide, what are the dangers? What are the abuses? What's going to kill us? And then to start deliberating and making sensible rules. After 2000, when there was a lot of mistrust about elections, there was that Baker-Carter Commission, and one of their bright lines was mail-in ballots are extremely problematic. And so as a starting point, it would be worth talking about, states that have incorporated the changes post-COVID and states that haven't, and where are the public mistrust issues, and what can be done to dispel notions, to shine a light, to let sunlight be a disinfectant. Because whenever something's new, there will be people that are sort of mistrustful of it because they don't understand it. And also new things really can be abused. That's the other thing, is they're understood by some quicker than others. And so anyway, all that's out there, I guess. But the crypto analog is really, for me, an interesting way of thinking about what government response is to innovation and where laws might be needed.
I've thought about this actually more than I should have, because as a foreign policy person, because a couple of years ago during the 2020 election, this was coming up a lot. I was doing a few local interviews and a couple with David Stafford. So I've thought about this. And there's a couple of thoughts. One, I'm sorry, Dr. Ramsey, but I'm going to start advocating blockchain voting. So we're just going to move all online. But when it comes to mail-in ballots, I think you guys are both making a good point, which is it feels new and out of control to people. And so that seems like there's some place for abuse there. And then you're hearing people say that abuse is happening. In the particular case of mail-in voting, though, it's not quite as novel and uncontrolled or dark as you might think. I mean, the first mail voting happened in mass during the Civil War because they wanted to make sure those guys, had access to voting. So it's not like it's a system that isn't tested. My first presidential vote was by mail because I was living out of state going to college. And it didn't occur to me that would be an issue. Military, U.S. military have been voting from their bases and so forth. But what is more new is mass mail-in voting. But even in that case, like Florida after 2000 actually expanded access to mail-in voting because I think the Republican legislature thought, well, we make sure the older Republican voters in particular have access to voting. But it's universal. It's not partisan in terms of who can access it. So Florida, for example, has a pretty well-established system. A couple of states, like Oregon, all of their voting is by ballot, I think. Now, and what they do is basically compare the names on the list versus the votes that come in. So it's not as if you could just throw in a bunch of names or people duplicate voting. It has to be on the roster. And then gets compared to that in a very specific way. I don't know about the Fetterman campaign suing about unmarked ballots, but in that case, it would go to the courts, and the courts would say, no, you can't do that. Here's the rule. So there's always a backstop, which is the courts, and you saw them acting pretty active after 2020. In that case, there were like 40 lawsuits that the Trump campaign brought in different places, and the courts, including a lot of Trump-appointed judges or Republican-leaning judges, said, this isn't working because there's a clear, transparent system that's accountable. So it feels a little weird, and as you guys are saying, and that there are these kind of dark points in the system, but most of these modern voting systems are pretty clear that that in which they're lining up the existing voting rolls with the ballots that come in. So there's not a lot of space actually for fraud to occur, at least on a mass scale. You do occasionally get people going around and collecting ballots and that sort of thing from time to time, but those are almost always very limited cases. I don't know how to make people feel, make your local professional feel better, because I don't know where they're getting their information. Because it's a kind of boring topic. Here are the, practical reasons that it's pretty reliable. But, that said, I like to vote early, but I always like to go to the polling place, that feels more reliable to me. It won't to me, something getting lost in the mail would be more of a problem than fraud occurring. But, that's my nutshell argument for why, in this case, mail-in voting is more reliable than it might feel to some people.
In Estonia, when I was in 2016, they actually have electronic voting. And I'm not sure, I really don't know how they do it, actually. I never really looked into that, but they have electronic voting. So there must be ways in which, I mean, if people can go into their banks, so they can actually move around their own money, from one account to the other and so forth. There might be secure ways electronically, but actually that might even be that might even raise even more suspicious on the minds of people. But again, I'm wondering what can be done to reassure people who are suspicious of all these ballots coming in after the election. And is there? I mean, I don't know. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Could ballots be notarized? I mean, would that might be? I don't know. That's where I think a lot of these suspicions come. All these ballots are coming after the election day, and like you say, I mean, they have always been mailing ballots for people who are ill at home that requested them. But when the Secretary of State mails out all these ballots to all these people, then that's what people get. People who have who are really mistrustful and who have a suspicious character of mind. I think there must be something that should be done to assure people that it's all in the up and up.
Believe it or not, I would say, if I can interject, if I can get the last word here as the moderator, is that in terms of the mail-in ballots, be more like Florida. Florida actually does a really good job. You have to have your mail-in ballot in before the deadline, and Florida is counting the mail-in ballots right along with the other results. So there is no surprise, thousands of vote dump after the fact in Florida because they're already counted. I think that's probably the best way. And when you look at something like Pennsylvania, where this seems to be the biggest issue of all these after the deadline mail-in ballots, that's a legislative issue where they had tried to change the election laws to where they counted these things ahead of time, and the legislature kept saying no. So in many ways, it was a self-created issue with an obvious solution of looking to Florida that wasn't taken into account. So it seems odd to say it, but look to Florida. Florida seemed to have learned its lesson after 2000. So with that, we had planned on going 75 minutes. We're a little beyond that. I appreciate everybody sticking with us. Thank you for all of your questions. They were phenomenal questions, and I sincerely apologize for not getting to all of your great questions. I wish we had more time, but we do not. I do suggest if you did have a burning question and you really wish it was answered, please feel free to email us. We'd be more than happy to have a little bit of a dialogue with you. So by all means, email us these questions. I appreciate you all showing up tonight. Again, thank you so much for your questions. And a special thanks to our panelists offering some great insight. And I look forward to the department hosting another one of these roundtable events soon. With that, we're going to call it a night. Thank you all. I hope you all have a great evening, and I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving holiday as well. Thank you all.